Good evening. It's good to be back with you again. We've got Heidi Hollis on with us and a great guest tonight, and Mark Muncy with Weird Florida. In Florida about 30% of the time, and it is a weird place, believe me. I mean, it's a lot weirder than you'd ever believe. And come to find out, even quiet old staid St. Petersburg is a hotbed of weirdness, which you wouldn't think, because you get the idea, Heidi, of people, playing shuffleboard and waiting to die down there. But
I'm sure it's heavily haunted just because of that. A lot of shuffling
ghosts. It probably is. But
a lot of people,
but anyhow,
the latter part of their lives, and this is their last place on Earth. I mean, makes sense.
Well, I guess it does, but that's why I insist on dying in a New York State so that I don't have to haunt Texas. And I mean, if these old bones have to cross the state line before I croak, if I have to go by ambulance, I won't die in
Jeez.
Worry about that later, though. But now we have some great news tonight, really great news. Different news stories.
Yeah.
Did you see that 60-minute special Sunday night on the expose of the DEA?
No.
And the whistleblower guy? Okay.
Nope.
What happened was this guy is a high-up official who is both a lawyer and a pharmacist, which is a weird combo.
Yeah.
And
so hold on, we got a lawyer and an engineer that's working.
Yeah,
here.
but I mean, this is specific for the DEA, though. See.
Yeah.
And what it is, though, is he at one time supervised 600 employees, and he was anyway. The battle was with Congress and this and that. Pennsylvania congressman named Marino and another one, and what it is, to make a long story short, is the government is completely, utterly in bed with the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, just like frickin' frack. And what happens is guys would leave, say, the DEA and so forth, and then they take jobs as lobbyists as consultants, if you will, to the pharmaceutical companies. In other words, the people that regulate them, they go and they tell them how to, get around rules and all that.
That sounds like politics, typical politics. Be a senator and go and be a lobbyist for all sorts of stuff.
Oh, yeah, but this is even more seedy, though, because it deals with law enforcement. And actually, Trump's drug czar, this Marino guy, has actually stepped down because of all the brouhaha that the CBS special caused. And just as an example, get this. You'll probably know things like this from your medical insights, but one town in West Virginia, Heidi, a town of 346 people, which must include some kids, one year they got 9 million doses of opioids sold in that town in 1 year. 9 million.
Sick.
We're talking a town of 346. Now, if that ain't crooked and sick, there's nothing that is. And why the poor slobs in West Virginia, I don't know. I guess the idea would be is they would be in turn reselling these things or something. I mean, no one could take that many and still be on the earth,
All right. Wow.
But this is the biggest thing 60 Minutes has had since I don't know when, and they've been talking about it ever since. And let's just put it this way. This guy at one time, I don't have his name handy right now, but all I got to do is Google 60 Minutes story on the opioids. But what it is they marginalized this guy because of the ruckus he was making, and they took him from basically supervising 600 people into some kind of mop room closet or something where he was supervising nobody and had marginalized them, basically. And that's what happened. I mean, it's so crooked.
That sounds typical. That's sick. That's terrible.
Oh, this is so sick. It makes you want to literally go outside and throw up. And then it went on to list a whole mess of other intertwining, associations, similar guys that were the DEA and, like I say, that crossed over on the other side. And it's just disgusting. And there's a phenomenal number of deaths associated with this every year, too. So anyway, I just thought...
They're murderers, in other words. They're murderers.
No doubt. Things. I mean, you can't sugarcoat it. That's what they are.
Yep.
And, I mean, they don't actually have a gun in their hand, but just about.
Just about. And, I would not want to go to the pearly gates with their history. Mm-mm.
No, and they know what's going on, Heidi. They're not stupid men. I mean, that's stupid men. This guy, the whistleblower guy, who's a lawyer and a pharmacist, that's a lot of education.
Right.
So anyway, that's the story. And like I say, as of today, I heard on the news that this theoretical Trump drug czar, he stepped down or something like that. And it's just a real bunch of ruckus. But I got to, once again, I've always been a CBS fan, going back all the way to Walter Cronkite. So I guess they've lived up to their reputation of excellence. I have to take my hat off to them. So anyway, on a less negative note, there's a excellent, and I mean excellent, new Marian apparition, which occurred to Indian school children in India. I mean, Middle Eastern Indian. And hundreds of them experienced the odor of sanctity and saw a vision of the Virgin Mary under an altar over there. And
that's wild.
And a lot of these kids were young kids, not even old enough to know the Virgin. I mean, some of them weren't even Christians that were exposed to this. They didn't know the Virgin Mary from Donald Trump. And what I'm saying is, and from experiencing the odor of sanctity, I could promise you, it's a pleasant thing, but there's no ignoring it, and there's no mistake here. I mean, you know what you experience, and especially young children that they don't know anything. So anyway, I thought that was pretty good. So that's a couple new Marian apparitions in just the last month.
It's amazing. So is the Catholic Church investigating?
Oh, yeah, they'd always do. They're pretty good about that now. I mean, they're some serious investigators, my boys. They really are. They're serious boys. But anyhow, we're coming close to the end. But now next week, we're going to have Gary Parker on, and he's going to talk about hidden alien messages in the pyramids. And then the guest of guests is going to be on the 31st, and that's going to be Pam Geller, not my baby, no.
Oh, okay.
But Pam Geller is going to be on, and she's got all kinds of insights in her website. You'll see she's on Fox and Friends all the time, and Hannity. She's just a hell of a guest. So we've got good stuff coming up. And I don't know, Heidi, you just got back from the Milwaukee Paranormal Conference. I guess you had a good time there. And all
it was fantastic. Got to meet Linda Godfrey again and chatted with some old friends from the Light Side group that are most likely in the chat room.
We better get back to the let Joe take a break, and we'll be right back. Well, it's great to be back with Mark Muncy and Heidi Hollis, my co-host, and we're talking about Eerie, Florida. And Mark, it's good to have you.
Hi, well, thanks for having me.
Well, we were talking, the thing that was so bizarre tonight is we were talking before the airtime, and we were talking about St. Petersburg, which most people think that St. Pete is a quiet shuffleboard playing place, and, people snore when they walk through it or something. But evidently it's a hotbed of ghostly activity and weirdness and every other thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's how we kind of started here was 20 years ago. I started running a little charity haunted house down here called Hellview Cemetery, and it actually got its name when we were first digging a fake grave in the yard for our yard display, and we started coming across bones and seashells, and we panicked and thought we'd found like a murder site, so we called the cops. The cops came out, and they're like, oh, no, this is an archaeological site. So we got an archaeologist, came out, and they said, oh, no, this is a shell midden. This is where the early Indians, either the Tocobagas or the Weeden Island people left, their garbage. So as long as you don't find any tools or anything, you just keep on going. And we're like, and they're like, we're just glad it wasn't one of the lost cemeteries. And
gee, I guess so, yeah.
And I'm like, wow. Lost cemeteries would tell me more. And they're like, oh yeah, there's like 5 pioneer cemeteries that were built here in the early days, and then these crazy things called tropical storms and hurricanes would come by, everybody'd run away, and then they'd come back and go, wow, look at all this flat land, let's put up a house. or put up a store. And so there's a few of them that are still missing to this day. One of them was called Hellview, and the Tales from the Crypt fan in me said, oh my God, it's got to be Hellview. That's going to be our haunted house. And so that's where we started collecting stories for all the way back then, 20 years ago.
Wow. You called it a haunted charity house? How does that? How do those two things go together?
It was like a Halloween haunted house where we scare people for charity. And
of course, that's what I always do all year round.
Yeah, exactly. But we did it for some local charity groups and made a lot of money for good cause before the city shut us down.
I love the concept. Scare the crap out of people for a good cause.
We used to call it a scare that cares.
Oh, I love it. That was so awesome. Very cool.
Well, what's funny, Mark, is that Heidi's from Wisconsin, which one would also normally associate with as a steady Freddy, beer drinking, cheese eating bunch of.
Oh, it is.
Countrified types, but there's all kinds of exotica up there too.
Oh yeah, no. Yeah, we started collecting stories with a website, and this will tell you how long ago it was. It was a GeoCities website, and the email address was AOL.
Taking me back.
Yeah. So that's where some of these stories are that old, and they were a lot of fun to dig back out when we started doing the book.
Wow.
Well, now mention the book and where to get it, and any websites or anything you want before we get going.
Yeah, before we delve into this, it's Eerie, Florida, Chilling Tales from the Panhandle to the Keys. It's from History Press, so you can get it at your local bookstore or any of those online places. But if you go to eerieflorida.com, we have a link you can order it from there from a local bookstore near us, and we actually sign it, and my wonderful illustrator, Kari Schultz, will be happy to draw a little something on the inside, and I'll be happy to scribble something on the inside for you.
Well, I've got to get my mitts on it because, as I've told you off the air, I'm 30% a Floridian. That's about how much of the time I spent, and it was an excellent childhood. We lived right near the Bahia Mar yacht basin. We were filthy rich, and all we did was scuba dive and deep sea fish and gamble and just lovely life. But my father got married so many times he dissipated the family fortune. He used to get married every time he'd smoke a cigarette or something. So anyway, but no, it was a good childhood. But I guess what I'm saying is I did have an early on experience I've mentioned to you is that our neighbors there were near there were senior Eastern Airlines pilots nearby. And they all saw the old movie, The Ghost of Flight 401 that Ernest Borgnine played in the 70s. They all saw that ghost on the cannibalized, recycled parts from the plane that went down. And,
yeah, that was, surprisingly, the movie still holds up pretty well, even though it is a little dated. But yeah, that's a common story. We've heard that one more than a few times.
Oh, well, and the only other side kicker I'd throw in is that the old man also did as a volunteer job. He used to hire boating instructors for all of South Florida. He did that as a volunteer thing with the Coast Guard, and because he sure didn't need the money. But anyway, he did it that way as a hobby, and in hobnobbing with these admirals, he found out that 10% of the accidents or disappearances were absolutely unexplainable. I mean, absolutely.
Wow.
The Coast Guard cutter would come up to a craft, and there'd be a cigarette burning in the ashtray, which might take 10 minutes or something, whatever. No signs of a struggle. And Heidi, from being down there, the sharks aren't waiting to just swallow you whole as soon as you step your foot over the side. I mean,
Right. Right.
And even in that time, my goodness, there'd still be blood in the water or whatever, a limb floating past or something. In other words, no signs of a struggle. Nowhere for these people could get away. I mean, they had sonar and radar even back then in the 70s. And they could tell within 10 miles around if a helicopter picked them up, if a fast craft took them off, if a submarine got them, they could tell that. Nothing, Heidi. Nothing.
I'm going to guess it's the skunk ape that's taking people, because just like Bigfoot in the woods, missing 411, they're talking about seeing hairy beasts running off with children. So why not the skunk ape?
We're talking about on the water, though, Heidi. We're talking about on the water.
Well, what, you mean apes can't swim? I'm just kidding.
No.
Well, there's
But I mean, no legitimate explanation, and I'm
That's
sure
weird.
Mark's got a lot weirder stuff than that. But anyway,
oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Let's go there. Tell us some good, juicy stories.
Well, do you guys want the dark history stuff, or do you want cryptids, or do you want ghosts? I can start either way.
Oh,
let's try the dark, and then we'll go to the ghost and the cryptid.
there you go.
Okay, well, I'll start with the darkest of the dark. You want to talk about government corruption?
Oh,
Yeah,
yes, one of our
yeah.
favorites. Yes.
All right.
Oh, that's one of our
Have
long-term.
you heard
favorites,
of the Dozier School for Boys, also called the Florida School for Boys?
No.
No.
Oh, all right. Well, this was basically state-sponsored child abuse and worse
Oh,
for over 100
really?
years.
Ah,
It was,
100 years?
Yeah, it started in around 1911. They opened this school up in the Panhandle near Marianna, Florida, called the Florida School for Boys. And what it was meant to be the place where you sent the worst of the worst kids, the kids that nobody else could handle. It was basically
surprised Kevin didn't go there. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, it was a little early.
basically maximum security for juvenile offenders, and they lovingly called it the Florida School for Boys for rehabilitation. And within a few years, they had facilities for 100 kids. They had over 500 within a few years.
Oh,
And
Wow.
it's Florida, it's summertime, it's hot, there's no AC, no nothing. And it was a terrible place. And abuse allegations started almost immediately, mostly from student to student violence, and even things like rape and other such. It was pretty terrible place. But then it spread to the staff pretty quick, the allegations. There were numerous incidents where people would come investigate school and say, yeah, this is terrible, but then nothing would be done. And this went on for decades. And what was weird was they didn't close it till 2011, and they started really researching it. This one Professor Kimmerly from USF started investigating. They had a boot hill with 34 grave markers from people who had died over there. Well, the problem is they only had records of 24 deaths over that 111 years. So they start doing some research, and they start checking out the grave sites, and they find 55 bodies.
Oh, geez.
And worse. And the records are so spotty. Anywhere you go, like if you go to some church in the middle of nowhere or some prison somewhere, and you say, "Hey, I'm looking for my great uncle's grave," they've got a record somewhere. Dozier didn't keep records, so it's things like student missing, presumed escape, or no longer here was my favorite note on some of the records. Just student no longer here, and yeah, exactly. And so they start doing even more research, and they find there's an organization called the White House Boys, and these are people who survived. And they call them the White House Boys because they had a building that they built that was supposed to be a solitary confinement building. They called it the White House. But actually, this is where they tortured and beat the snot and worse out of kids. And they had these big industrial fans installed in it, and they would turn those on, and it was supposedly to drown out the screams.
Good
And
Lord.
some of the boys' stories are just terrifying. They talk about one giant black whip called Black Beauty that the superintendent used to use on them, that was so long it would hit the wall, hit the ceiling, and then come down on your back. So you'd hear this tap, tap, crack.
Must have been nuns in there. You know how the Catholics roll, right, Kevin? Yeah.
No, that's not that. That is absurd.
So yeah, some kids would
Methodist.
have to know how many times they were beat by the kid next to them, who was in the cell next to them, counting for them, because they'd pass out after a few beats. And it's just terrifying. And only this year, 2017, did the state Senate finally acknowledge that there were problems there and apologize to the White House Boys.
Problems.
A little late now. Oh,
Exactly.
Can they sue the state for that, or?
That's there's a lot of stuff going on still about this, and it's still a story developing. It recently, as January of this year, they dug up a grave that had been sent. They sent a coffin up north to be buried, and they finally found most of these kids were like runaways and orphans, so they, it's hard to find families and DNA evidence and stuff like that. But they finally found a great nephew who had his granduncle dug up so they could check his body out up in Tennessee somewhere. And he had been sent, the coffin had been sent from Dozier, but Dozier had no records of his death. Said, the note that they had sent with the coffin said, escaped and hit by train. And so it was a sealed coffin.
Wow.
So when they dug up the coffin, there was no body. It was just wood inside the coffin.
Oh, wow. Talk about cover up.
Yeah, exactly. So no one knows really how far it went. The town is just starting to come to grips with it because, most of the people who work there lived in that town. So it's pretty dark, and they're trying to figure out what to do with the bodies now because the state's trying to sell the land as quickly as possible. And, but they're still, the White House boys and their lawyers are trying to keep it so that they can open investigations and find stuff.
Wow.
Good deal. That's a heck of a story. That really is.
So there you go. Right off the bat. Isn't that a lovely story?
That's gross.
Holy moly. Yes, it really is.
Jeez.
Wow, for 100 years, that's a heck of a negative history for a long time.
That is. That's bad. So what's next? Did you investigate this, how haunted that area is? My goodness.
Well, that was what we originally were intending to write about. That was because we'd heard so many ghost stories, and you could still hear the tap, tap, crack of Black Beauty in the White House and all this. And
really? Wow.
And you can hear the boys running and playing and, other noises and screams in the night. And supposedly you can still hear the industrial fans kick on in the White House, even though there's no power there anymore. The problem is the land is sealed. It's, there's a security guard there 24/7, and you can't get in without special permission. They're still fighting. The archaeologist who's been doing all this is still having trouble getting on the land to do further investigations because they're, it's private owner now, and it's, partially owned by the state, and they're just stonewalling everything. Exactly.
Right.
So we started to write that, but then that's when we found the real stuff was just so horrible. We talked to a few of the White House boys, and it was more than just about spreading the word and how terrible the place really is.
Right. Good.
So how old are these White House boys that you've been speaking to?
Some are in their 30s because they were recent. Some were in their 50s who, experienced it when they were very young. And, we've met a couple from all over. And if you go to the whitehouseboys.org, I think you can read some of their stories, and they are terrifying.
Wow.
Boy.
That's pretty twisted stuff.
Yeah, I thought we'd start with the fun one right off the bat. So,
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, okay.
on that upbeat note, where do you want me to head next, guys?
Well, go there, wherever you want to go.
Whatever suits you. Whatever suits you.
What's the next creepy thing that you've
So
come
how
across?
about?
No, I don't mean to interject. But we got about a minute before the first break, or the bottom of the hour break, and so we might just give a preface to it before you get.
All right. Well, we'll go from the north. That's up in the Panhandle. How about we go as far south as we can go, and we'll go down to Key West, and we'll talk about Robert. And we'll talk about Robert the Doll.
Oh boy, that thing is ugly.
Well, I've heard about that.
You gotta be nice to Robert.
I know, Robert.
I'm not just going to tell the story about Robert. I'm going to talk about his curse.
Robert will get you.
Well, the Key West has always been an interesting place anyway, and I guess they're going to recover from the hurricane issues. But as soon as we get back from the break, we'll talk about Robert the Doll. And once again, the book is called Eerie, Florida. There's a subtitle.
Yeah, Chilling Tales from the Panhandle to the Keys.
Excellent. Well, I'll tell you what, let's go to our break, and we'll be right back. Well, it's great to be back with Mark Muncy and Heidi Hollis, and golly, that was a rough story. Well, it is funny, though, but I mean, not funny, but I mean, it's odd that when you realize there's a lot of dark history in a lot of similar places, it's just, oh golly.
There's a sister school for the girls that still has accusations, and it's still open. So that's one that's still being investigated.
Oh, really?
Had
So
to
it's
make
just as
it
bad
doubly.
Yeah.
Wow.
just as bad on their end?
Yeah, it's a little further over the state, but yeah, that's dark rumors about that one too, and they're still investigating that one. So
Equal opportunity is not always appreciated. Let's just put that
I
there.
guess not. Golly, Bill. But let's not get into this old Robert the doll for those who are not familiar with it.
okay, well, Robert is a wonderful doll that is about 3 foot tall and has a little sailor suit, and he carries a little lion with him in his arm, and he is notorious as being alive. He had a child that was his owner named Robert Eugene, and Robert Eugene, once he got the doll, immediately stuff started happening. Toys were breaking, the help was getting scared away and wouldn't stay. Said they heard him talking to the doll and the doll answering back in a different voice. So so rumors immediately start with this doll, and so the parents are going to him, saying, Robert, you've got to stop this. And he's like, no, it wasn't me, it was Robert. And they're like, wait a minute, you're Robert. And he's like, no, I'm going to go by Eugene because the doll wants to go by Robert, so there won't be any confusion.
Wow.
And that type of thing today would get you locked up, but back then, that was okay. And years go by. The stories about Robert are numerous and way too numerous to list here. He separates from the artist, and he's stuck in. They leave him in the house when they move away, but then as the house is empty, people still see Robert in the windows of the attic, and then down in the floor, in the living room, moving around. Yeah, and then a new owner comes in, and then there's more stories, but. Eventually, Robert finds his way to the Fort East Morello Museum, which is where he is today. And it's an art museum. That's in Key West. And he very rarely leaves. And occasionally he makes some travels, but he's always in his little case there with his little lion. And the thing about Robert is, well, besides being the inspiration for Chucky, from the movies. The big thing about Robert is you have to be very nice to Robert. You can't call him ugly. You can't be disrespectful. And you have to ask his permission when you take his picture. And if you don't, you will get the curse of Robert. And that was the thing that fascinated us the most, was the curse, because there's this wall behind Robert that is filled with handwritten letters of people begging forgiveness for being disrespectful for Robert, and begging for him to take off their curse, because he's done terrible things to them. And my favorite, just to give you a sample, and this is kind of a fun one, is this guy says, "Dear Sir Robert, I am so sorry I made fun of your leather face. Leather is actually nice for a face, and I shouldn't have made fun of you. I also took your picture without permission and said some other not nice things. We're sorry. We get the message. We've deleted the pictures. Please remove your curse. Please fix my eye, my Xbox, and my marriage."
Wow. That's, you don't think it's a little superstitious, though? People are playing upon?
I just love that was the order he put him in. The eye first, so he can play his Xbox. The Xbox,
of course.
And if you got the Xbox before the marriage, I think you got other problems. So
That's
well, there was a saying. The guy was on TV the other day, and he was an evil character on one of the TV shows, and he said, "Marriages, half of them don't work out, and the other half, everybody's miserable." So I mean, everybody can relate to that. But
wow, that is wild.
But that's a fun one. That was there. Like I said, the whole wall is filled with those. You can just spend a day reading those letters, and some of them are just absolutely hysterical, and some of them are downright spooky. You're going, "Oh my gosh, what happened to these people?"
Right, but
don't you see the ghost? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh no, it just seems like things may be coincidentally just going wrong at the same similar timing, and it's like. They just attribute it to the curse, but I mean, where did this notion come from?
That was, part of the story is that he's always been vindictive. If people disrespect him, he's been very vindictive. Those go back to the early legends of him. And, that Robert's, other Eugene's parents were not nice to him. And that was, when bad stuff started happening to them. So it goes all the way back to that. It's pretty interesting stuff. There's some odd stuff that's happened with Robert over the years. We talked to one of the museum managers, and he had a great story about locking up one night and then coming back the next day, and Robert was out of his case and standing by the front door with sand on his shoes like he'd taken a walk on the beach. Some other weird stuff like that. So, and he was dead serious. I was like, oh my gosh, what's fun? So.
That's crazy.
But Robert has gone high tech, so he has a Twitter and an email that you can reach him if you need to, beg his forgiveness now. So.
Oh, well, lucky. And to spread his curse around, of course.
Sure.
My goodness. So what's one of the craziest things that you've ever come across as far as actual investigation that you've personally done?
Well, I will say the weirdest place we went to, the obvious crazy, funnest place we went to was Casadega, which is a town in the middle of Florida, just past Sanford on the way to Daytona on the I-4 corridor. And it's the psychic center of the world, supposedly. It was founded by a guy who was guided there by his Indian spirit guide. And he founded this town. It's a psychic commune, and it is sometimes called the psychic mecca of the world. And they have more mediums and psychics than you can possibly imagine at this old, beautiful 1920s hotel that was built there. Oh, really? There's a psychic community there. And the thing we investigated there was a place called the Devil's Chair. And in this weird town, it's a little goofy town. I love that their shirt says where the Twilight Zone meets Mayberry. Because it is just this little rustic Florida town, but with enough odd stuff. But the thing is, the legend that drew us there was this thing called the Devil's Chair that was in the cemetery at Casadega. Well, if you go to the Casadega website, it doesn't say that they have a cemetery. It in fact says there is no cemetery in Casadega. Really? And you go, well, okay. Well, how come there's a legend about this thing? Well, right. And then you go into the town, you ask at the bookstore, hey, where's the cemetery? No cemetery here in Casadega. Well, there is a cemetery. It's right next to Casadega, called the Casadega Lake Helen Cemetery, which is, hey, there's a town there called Lake Helen. But the cemetery there has some mourning chairs. And the mourning chairs there are, old 1800s brick chairs that people put up to, visit their relatives and give you a place to sit down, especially in the Florida heat. Just a nice little place to relax and, visit with your lost loved ones. Well, of course, most of these chairs all over New England and all the way down, they all have legends, a lot of them. And this one, of course, one of these chairs is supposedly built by the devil. And if you go sit in this chair at midnight, you will be visited by the devil, and he will grant you a wish. So
what does he look like? What are they describing this devil?
They say he's a dark shape that approaches you at midnight and will, grant you your wish. Well, when you try to investigate this place, if you go there at midnight, you will be approached by a dark shape. It's called the police. Because it is a private property and there is no trespass. So it's one of those, you can't test the legend too much there. So, so they've updated the legend to now if you leave a beer at the chair, it will be drunk by morning and you'll still get your wish. And I have a feeling you're leaving it for the cops. But because they do patrol it pretty thoroughly now, especially on full moons and holidays like Halloween and stuff like that. They patrol it pretty heavily.
Goodness.
But the spookiest was a place we did up on Amelie Island, which is way back up north, just north of Jacksonville, right on the Georgia border. Right. And the Fernandina Beach has this great place called the Agins Creek Greenway, which is this beautiful nature trail. And you can go there and wander around, see some wetlands and some wonderful live oak forest. But there's a part of it that is no longer on the map. There's part of it that's no longer part of the Agins Creek Greenway. and it's right next to Fernandina Beach High School. And it says, when you walk up to it, it says used to be a student nature trail, but the school has no records of them ever actually using it. And the legend there is that it is the grave of a witch and her pet demon, Wickedemus.
Holy mackerel.
From a lost colony that predates Roanoke. And now there aren't any records of any colony there, but there are some, it was on the shipping lanes between St. Augustine and, some of the stuff up north. So it's not without reason that there could have been some sort of town there. Well, this town was supposedly possessed by witches, and a pilgrim boat landed there, and then the witches all chased him out of town except for one guy who missed the boat, but secretly he was a witch finder, and he knew the town was cursed, so he frees the town, catches them all, and it finally boils down to one little girl who had the power of this control of this demon named Wickedemus. And if you walk down this path, you find this stone at the base of this oak tree where she was supposedly hung. And if you say the name Wickedemus enough, the demon will rise, or the girl will give you a wish. Yeah, it's a lot of wishes in these legends. And
apparently,
you'll get her witchcraft powers. Well, the odd thing was we went there on a nice, January day in Florida, which was pretty, nice and sunny. It's typical in Florida here. And of course we found the stone on this creepy path, and we go, all right, let's do this. Wickedemus, Wickedemus, Wickedemus. And then suddenly the wind picked up like crazy. And it was just insane. We couldn't get audio on our video at the time because it was just so windy. And so that was probably the creepiest thing that happened.
My goodness, you'd like to tempt fate.
Well, that was part of the job. So,
wow,
that's amazing.
It's called legend tripping for a reason. So,
have you ever got yourself into trouble because you went about doing something like that?
There have been some spooky times, but I don't think anything, that I would consider trouble. There's a couple stories that some people didn't want us looking into, and so we had some issues, just getting information on them. But and some people who were like, especially Dozier was one of them. We, like I said, they were, every door got closed. Even the security guard was like, "I'd love to take you in and show you this stuff because I know it's terrible." But, he's like, I answer to this lady up on high, so, can't do it. I think that was more the spooky stuff.
Wow. Well, you're lucky that you didn't bring anything home with you.
Yeah, I guess so, really.
Yeah, because I've heard a lot of people who do something like what you did, calling upon that name or something weird, conjuring something up and, essentially poking a stick in the eye of a monster. It's what they call legend tripping. It's the modern day Bloody Mary in the mirror. You never know. You got to try, and that's have you tried that? Is that what you're trying to tell me? You've done the Bloody Mary?
Oh no.
Okay, good.
Maybe I should try that one. Hold on.
Oh gosh, no! Don't do it. Don't do it. It's horrible.
No, running a haunted house for 20 years, I figured if we were going to stir something up, we'd have stirred it up here. And we've had some unusual experiences. I've had some odd stuff in my life. Of course, it's one of the reasons why I'm interested in this stuff.
Sure.
But a lot of this was just fun stories that we discovered, and some of these emails were just fantastic and great to look up. I'll tell you about the Gnomes of Bock Tower if we got time.
Sure, we do. We got a lot of time for the top of the hour break. We do.
All right. Well, this is one of my favorite stories from the book. It's also one of the funnest stories we had researching, and it's one I don't think any other book on Florida had, because I got this email from this little old lady years ago who lived in Lake Wales, Florida. Now, Lake Wales is right in the heart of the state. Kind of near where Legoland is now. But they are famous for Bock Tower, which is this beautiful singing tower that an old man named Bach built to be a nature preserve because he loved the area so much. It's the highest point in Florida, a whopping 223 feet above sea level. So, yeah. It's bigger than Space Mountain. It's crazy. But it's just this beautiful plain, and you can see the tower for miles. Near the town is one of those famous gravity hills called Spook Hill, where you park your car, put it in neutral, and it rolls backwards uphill.
They've got a lot of those, don't they? I mean, over the country.
All over the place. Really... It's one of those great ones that it's got a great Indian legend behind it. The town embraces it. There's an elementary school there called Spook Hill Elementary that actually has Casper the Friendly Ghost as their mascot. And one of my favorite things is while you're waiting to park your car and put it in neutral, you can see kids playing on the field next to you, and they're chasing balls uphill, which is...
Yeah, they got one... It's amazing. That's so widespread. They got one around Lake George in New York, or something like that. So
yeah, they're all over the place. It's an optical illusion, but it really is. When you're there, it's crazy. But anyway, Bock Tower. This little lady, she had a farm there. She was a little girl on her aunt's farm in 1949 to 1950. We're still trying to narrow down the date exactly. So this is an old story, and sadly she'd passed away, so I couldn't get exact dates on this. But we did find a witness. But anyway, the story goes, she was on her aunt's farm, and they were noticing the fruit was missing from their orange grove. And they thought they might have fruit rats, but usually fruit rats left holes in the fruit, or where they're just nibbling on it. You'd still find some peels and stuff, but these were just gone. So they didn't know what was going on. So they thought maybe they had people stealing their fruit, maybe neighbors or maybe something else. But so they put up some traps, they put up some ropes. Oh. And the next day they catch a little man about 6 inches tall, naked, covered in hair.
Whoa.
Screaming at them in a foreign language that they didn't understand. And they didn't know what to do with him. So they call the cops. The cops come out, and the cops don't know what to do with this guy. They can't arrest him, with handcuffs because he's so tiny. And they know he's not a baby because he's covered in hair. They can't quite figure out that, now this is, at this point, Florida had become kind of a circus mecca because Ringling was wintering down here, and he was building his big mansion in Sarasota. Yeah, exactly. And then a bunch of other circuses moved down here because, hey, that's, if he's down here, let's get the cast-offs. And so that's where the town of Gibsonton, Florida, which is near Tampa, kind of became a mecca for, circus freaks and circus performer families and all that. And it's still got that reputation to this day. But anyway, so this isn't too far from there. So they've kind of seen some stuff like this. Tom Thumb, Ripley's museum was being built in St. Augustine. So, they knew some of this. So they weren't, it wasn't out of the question. This could be a circus performer or something. So they didn't know what to do with him, but they were like, well, worst case, we got him for, best case, we got him for trespassing. So they let him loose, not knowing what else to do. And the family's like, yeah, this little guy is not stealing all our fruit. So they let him loose. A night later, they catch him again. And this time they're like, okay, this is crazy. And the cops, still not knowing what to come back out, not knowing what to do, they put him in an orange crate and take him to the police station. That's when all hell breaks loose. The house is pelted by rocks. Tree branches are flying at the house. They don't know what's going on. They go outside, and there's dozens of these little guys throwing rocks at their house and screaming at them. So they call the cops back. The cops bring the little guy back. I guess this is a little while later. And they tried to get a Portuguese translator. They tried to get a Spanish translator. Nothing was working. So they let the guy loose again out of the orange crate. And then they all run off into the woods. And the cops are like, I guess you're just going to keep losing your fruit, and there's nothing we can do about this. This is weird.
Yeah, I guess.
So it's an odd story.
When was this? When did this happen? What year?
1949 to 1950, somewhere in there.
And you met a witness that saw the little stinkers.
Here's the thing. Here's the story. So this lady was telling us all about it, and like I said, this was years ago when I was still running the haunt. So we used to put a gnome in the haunt every year, and that was my joke, was that I had this story, and that was my little private joke that I knew. But when we started researching for the book, we kind of had this rule. It was, Weekly World News used to say if you had one witness, you ran it. That was gold. And modern journalism, you want 3 or 5 credible sources. We've kind of split the difference. As long as we had 2. Well, on a last ditch effort, because I really wanted to use this story somewhere, I reached out on Facebook to a group of, hey, you grew up in Lake Wales, on Facebook, and I put in there, does anybody know anything about little weird people, in the 50s? And sure enough, I got an answer from a guy who worked for the police department there. And he said he remembered the weird little guy being brought in the orange crate.
And he's supposedly
Get out.
And so they're trying to find, he's actually talking with the officers of Lake Wales, trying to find the records for that. We still haven't found those yet because we don't know the exact date, but he was the one who narrowed it down to 1949, 1950. And records from that time are pretty spotty at best, so it may be a while before we find them. But the Lake Wales Police Department's actually looking for them. And but what's the best part about the story is I guess what solved it was at the end they talked to one of the neighboring farmhands who told them that they were red caps, and they had offended, some way offended them, and the only way to stop them was to get a blessed rock from Ireland. So they sent away to Ireland and got a rock blessed by a priest at a holy stone to be put onto their orchard. And once it got there, they never had problems again. That was what the old lady told me.
So these were like transplanted leprechauns or something?
Yep. And we've heard some people say that they might have been like Indonesian or some other, crazy legends like that, just some sort of relative of leprechaun. And, who knows? We went to look for the rock. We had the directions from the little old lady, and it is in the side of Bock Tower. We did find the orchard. It's now a big private company orchard that, makes orange juice of all things. And we got permission to drive on the property. The problem is if you take the directions to the rock, we got there and it's this big clearing, and I'm like, oh my God, we're going to find it. And there are all these white boxes there. And we look, and that's where they keep their bees to pollinate the oranges. So we didn't get a picture of the rock. We kind of took off in a hurry.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that.
But that's where my wonderful illustrator, Kari Schultz, stepped in and drew a wonderful, one of my favorite pictures in the book is her adaptation of the gnome in the orange crate.
Well, actually, upstate New York has a deal with, they're called them puckwudgies. And they're like little leprechaun-y types and milling about.
Yeah, I guess that's the way you got to work out deals with these guys. Otherwise, they'll eat all your fruit.
I guess so, but does Wisconsin have anything like that, Heidi, or do you know?
Don't mind me. I'm in between things. A place called Haunchyville, and it's kind of a legend of a whole little town of little people. And how they come across them and everything. I'm not an expert on the legend, so I couldn't. Don't quote me, but yeah, if you look up Haunchyville, you'll find this legend of a town of little people. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, some of the Dutch explorers of the state originally mentioned that they found a tribe of little people and that they massacred them all because they were tried to hurt them. And, there's some odd, these stories go back a long way.
Wow. That's crazy. Wow.
Well,
abusive
what,
giants.
we're coming up to the top of the hour break. And, but Mark, you want to mention once again your book and any websites or anything else relative to it before we take our break?
EerieFlorida.com. That's, if you hit that, that'll, you can see some of our latest stories where we're going to be for author signings. And like I said, Kari Schultz comes with me, the illustrator, and she draws in the books, and you get yourself a nice little print. If you order from the website, we can get you that way. Otherwise, you can get a regular copy through your usual channels.
Okay, well, let's go to our top of the hour break, and we'll be right back, maybe taking some ghost stories or something. Well, it's good to be back on with Mark Muncy and Heidi is having little Bermuda Triangle issues up in Chicago, but that's all right. She'll resurface. But Mark, I was just going to say during the break that even, of course, this isn't way back in, too far in yesteryear, but when I used to drive up from Jacksonville back to Atlanta, that area down there is pretty exotic too, because, oh, Mark, you'd go for miles and there'd be not even a stop sign, not even a street light. And I was just thinking that if you were a modern day pirate or a smuggler or something, that would be the perfect place. Blackbeard the pirate used to hang out there. It'd be the perfect to evade the Coast Guard and stuff, talking miles and miles of nothing. And yeah, I'm sure Florida.
There's some great stories in that area of, the Deltona lights, which are ghostly lights that follow you on the interstate. And then it looks like a car coming at you, and then it goes over your car, and then they split up and turn around and come right behind you. And
really?
Creepy stuff. And then there's also an area kind of near Daytona on I-4. They call it the dead zone because cell phones sometimes stop working, watches stop working, people lose time there. And it's noted because the cops find more people asleep on the side of the road there than any other interstate. Yeah, they're like their cars pulled over, they're asleep, and they don't even remember pulling over and falling asleep. Yeah, so
really? That's bizarre.
Creepy area. The truck drivers talk about it too when they're on their CBs, that it's the it's the dead zone. Well, the ones that still use CBs, most of them use cell phones now.
And that's out of right I-4 north of Daytona Beach, or something?
Yeah, north of Daytona, just about as you hit I-95, heading up towards St Augustine, Jacksonville. So,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, home of the St. John's River monster, Pinky the sea monster.
I lived in Jacksonville for a very short time after I got out of the Army. I lived there for a little while till I moved up to Atlanta. But I didn't know they had a monster down there.
Yeah, the St. John's River, Pinky the sea monster. He's famous in the 70s. He was kind of Florida's Nessie. He was. There's lots of sightings of monsters, sea monsters up there. They have most of the lakes up there have some sort of creature sighting. There's the Lake Astor monster, the creature from Lake Helen Blazes, which is one of my favorite lakes names ever. Pinky was notorious because he was right off of I-95, and this family was on a boat out fishing near Lake Monroe, and they saw this creature pop up with a giant snail-like head with big horns or eye stalks, and they were, and he was pink, the color of boiled shrimp, but he had a big shell on his back like a giant turtle, and then when he dived back under the water, they saw the big tail crashing about 20 feet away. So a giant monster, and that made the press, and that was big news back in the day. That was in the height of the In Search Of days. So everybody was Nessie mania.
Day or what year you reckon?
This would have been late 70s. So yeah.
Wow.
And so that was a crazy story up in that area. But your pirates. And you were kind of mentioning ghosts before the break. There's a great couple pirate ghosts in St. Augustine. St. Augustine, the oldest city in America.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, predates Plymouth Rock by 60 years. And I'd say the oldest continuously inhabited city, because there's some other places that might have been founded quicker but didn't last. Yeah. But St. Augustine's got this beautiful fort, the Castillo de San Marco, which is made out of coquina, and it's still there, survives every hurricane, survives every storm, because the stuff is just so soft and malleable, and it's survived numerous pirate attacks. And it's kind of cool because when you go there, you see what it was is basically they would fire cannons into this stuff, and this stuff was just coral and mud, and the cannonballs would just sink into it. And then at night, the soldiers would go outside, dig out the cannonballs, and then take them upstairs and fire them back at the pirate ships. So,
holy smokes, that's crazy.
Good.
Yeah,
well, it is pretty. If you've never seen it, Heidi, it really is the St. Augustine Fort down there.
I've not seen it. No.
More ghosts than you can possibly imagine in that city, of course.
Wow.
Was it been €1,500 or something.
Yeah, 1560. I want to say 1565.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And they, and it's, there's great places to visit. Wolf's Museum of Oddities is a great place to visit there. They have a pirate museum there. They have Ripley's is there in this old hotel, and they have ghost tours in there, and they even do investigations there all the time. The city gates outside are notorious for a haunting, and that was one of my first real experiences was at that gate. We were on one of our first ever tours of St. Augustine. This was years ago when my children were kind of small. To put it in perspective, they're both in college now. But my youngest was about 5 years old, and her and I, we were on this walking tour with my then wife and oldest child, and they were staying with the tour, and we got a little tired, so we walked ahead and sat down in front of the city gates, which is this, the old gates to the old city when it was a walled city right across from the fort. And the big cemetery over there was called the Huguenot Cemetery, and that's where the ghost tour was talking about stuff, and we were sitting by the gates. My daughter was just running around, and then she comes over to me and says, Dad, this little girl told me to look out for Jack, that Jack would get me if I stayed too close to the town. And I'm like, okay. She was like 5, so I assumed it was...
That would be enough for me to get up and go.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, so this is some sort of friend she's, that I just haven't seen, or, just
right.
Something. Well, then the ghost tour catches up to us, and he starts talking about the city gates, and he's saying, when the town first joined, back into America, when Florida finally came back to being, was actually handed off by the Spanish to the U.S., that shortly thereafter there was a big yellow fever outbreak. And so they banned all burials in the city, and they started burying people out in that cemetery that they just walked past. And they said that the first one of the first ones to go was the gatekeeper here. And the gatekeeper had a daughter who hung out with him. And then after he died, the little daughter stayed around and warned people to beware of yellow fever. And then she died, but her ghost was still seen to this day. And I turned to the guide and said, would they have called the fever Jack? He said, oh, yeah, they used to call it Yellow Jack.
Oh, really?
Come on.
And I looked down on my daughter, and I to this day, I still get goosebumps. And that's her first childhood memory, is the one thing she remembers is talking to that little girl at the gate.
Good grief.
Wow, that is super scary. Now, you had mentioned that you had personal experiences living in a haunted house. What's some of the creepy stuff that you've dealt with?
Well, like I said, we ran the haunted house was, as an attraction. It was, people jumping out and scaring people for fun. But, we've had some odd stuff happen. Like we'll hear, people talking in other rooms and nobody home. For a while there, years ago, going through a custody battle with my ex for my kids, I would hear the kids in the other room and knowing that they're gone, they're in another city. And it liked to mimic things, whatever it was, it liked to mimic things. And it, we still get the occasional, you'll get that cold sensation. Here it is in Florida, 96 degrees on this wonderful, fall day. And you still get that chill, and it's like, what is that? So
Goodness.
I mean, there's definitely, I don't want to say, well, is it a ghost? Is it this? I am of the opinion that it's just something we don't understand yet. I like to call it preternatural, just something we don't quite understand.
I just had an experience like that over the weekend, believe it or not, with staying at my sister's. And she hears a baby in her basement, and she's like, listen. She's like, you hear that? And she's like, that's the baby sound. And I'm like, I thought you got rid of that because she'd had an issue before. She said, and then we heard her son say, Mom. And she goes, and usually after the crying stops, it wakes him up. And then she walks down there to go see what he wanted. He was sound asleep.
No.
Yeah, so it mimicked him. She said, you heard him clear as day, didn't you? I'm like, yes, I did. It was very strange.
Oh,
I'm
boy.
like, so it's mimicking. And I told her before it was demonic. I mean, this thing, the way that it cries.
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah, and now mimicking. Ooh, not cool.
Yeah, one night at the haunt, we had a paranormal investigation group come through, and they were spirits of St. Petersburg, the St. Pete Paranormal Society, and their Professor Brandy Stark is the leader of them. But this was in the early days of them, and they came through and they had their medium come up to us, and she's like, "Do you guys know you have a fear monger that you've created with this haunted house?" And we're like, "What's that?" And they're like, "It's an entity that feeds on fear, and it lives in your backyard now." And we're like, "Well, I guess we're keeping it well fed." Yeah.
Yikes.
But, I was like, "Man, can we charge extra for that?" I don't know.
I always thought that theme parks must be loaded with demons that like to feed off fear.
I guess, yes. Horror nights and Howl-O-Scream were pretty popular, so.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad I'm a Catholic. I don't have to worry about any of that. Gee whiz.
You'd like to think so.
Well, the best part about St. Augustine was their Catholic bishop, Augustin Varro. Do you know his story?
No.
Okay, he was basically the head of the Catholic Church in the South right around the time of it becoming part of the U.S., all the way up through the Civil War. And he was well loved. He was from Le Puy, France, and he founded several convents and sisterhoods and other wonderful things. And he was actually one of the first to transcribe Bibles in some of the lost Indian languages to try to convert. So he's one of the reasons we actually still have a couple of the Indian languages, even though most of those Indians, like the Menorcans and the Timucuans, have passed away and have no descendants left. We actually have some of their languages because Augustin Varro helped translate their Bibles. Well, and then, and he also was one of the first to try to let the freed slaves be part of the Catholic Church and embrace them. And so he was well loved, and he dies in 1876, and it's June in Florida. And they say, look, this guy, everybody wants to come visit this guy all the way from France, and the Pope may come visit this guy because he was so loved. And basically, if you saw a church anywhere in the South from Georgia all the way down to Florida, even South Carolina, North Carolina, if it was built in the 1800s, Augustin Varro was probably the one who got the money for it. So he's a big name. So they really wanted to have this beautiful ceremony for him, and they're like, you got to keep him in an open casket. Everybody wants to see him, and they're like, but this is the early days of embalming, and the church doesn't like it, so they put him on ice and hay.
Oh, really?
And to try to.
Well, I tell you what, Mark, let's just, for just a minute, because we're coming up to our last break.
Sorry.
This is a fascinating story. I'm really tremendously intrigued, but we're going to our last break, and guys, we'll be right back with Mark and Heidi. We'll be right back. Well, it's good to be back on with Mark, Eerie, Florida, and Heidi with nutty Wisconsin, or whatever they are out there. I'm really sorry. I don't mean on a separate topic. I don't want to interrupt Mark's story, but I was really sorry about your boy Rogers going down. I really kind of a fan of
that hurt us all. That hurt the country. That was a sucker punch if I ever saw one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I love the commercial.
Packers.
I love the commercial he does with the dog and all that, and the Ford or Chevy or whatever he's pushing.
My goodness. But on to Mark's story. What happened, Mark?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, like we said, so Augustine passed. Embalming is still kind of frowned on by the church at this point, but they needed to keep the body any way they could. So this is June. This is Florida. 90 some odd degrees and 110% humidity. It's just a mess. So they put him on ice and straw, packing him like meat, basically. And they dug a hole in the ground to put him in, just to kind of keep him in the shade and all that. It's not working. So somebody gets the brilliant idea of, let's put him in a metal airtight coffin. That'll help. But we'll still keep him on ice. We'll still keep him in the straw, but we'll keep him in this metal coffin. Well, somebody else says, well, but they still got to see him, so we got to put a glass lid on it. So that's what they do. They put a glass lid on an airtight metal coffin with ice and hay as he's decomposing in June in the heat. And the gases are building up inside the body as he's doing his thing. And what they've built is a pressure cooker.
Oh, golly.
And guess what happens? And the story, the legend's a little blurry on whether it happened at the end of the funeral or just after. But Augustin Varro is now known as the exploding bishop of St. Augustine, as he exploded out of the glass and all over the place. There's this beautiful basilica there in St. Augustine, and there are still chips in the wall that they will point out was probably where the bishop took a couple chunks out.
Nasty. I was stunned when I went into St. Peter's, to the Vatican, and saw the popes in glass cases. I was blown away. And I'm like, are those real? They're real. Just, shocking for us non-Catholics. But anyways.
So they had some volunteers clean them up. They put them back in a solid metal casket, and they put a metal lid on it. Buried him in the Tolamato Cemetery, which is the Catholic cemetery inside St. Augustine. And he's there. When you look down the path in Tolamato, you see this big bust, and that's the bust of Augustine. For anybody who wants to see him now, you can see his bust because he is rusting in pieces.
Oh,
wow. That's a rough way to go, boy.
That's gosh. Somebody put "There She Blows" in the chat room. There's a question for you. I've lost it, but it said, oh, here it is from Preston. What's the craziest story you've been told but too afraid to talk about?
Oh, gosh. Well, one of the stories we talked about, we were a little worried about talking about, and it was called, it's actually here in St. Pete, and that's mini lightning or mini lights. And it's a story told on the south side about if you stay out late, mini lights will get you. And it's it's usually African American kids who are terrified of it. And we couldn't figure out why. The legends were all over the place. One was about a lady who ran a boarding house for circus performers, and that her name was Minnie Lights, and then which is an odd name. And then people would go out and shout at her because they didn't like that she kept circus people. But then these dwarfs would come out and chase the people away with baseball bats.
Good man.
And so, but then we start researching into that, and we find out, there was a lady who ran a boarding house, but she was a Mennonite. So that might be where the word converted. And there was a circus fire, but there was no boarding house fire. So it's, there's a lot of legends that blurred there. But, it still didn't quite make sense with these, ghosts or little. And then we started hearing about alligator people who were that are the mini lights. They're little alligator dwarfs. And I'm like, what a crazy story. And as we're researching it, people would, deadly serious. Oh, don't go messing with the mini lights, man. You don't want to mess with this. And it's like, what is going on? And then, so we start looking into it even further, and we find, the history of it was actually super crazy, because St. Petersburg, it was as far south as you could get for a while before just hitting swamp. And it was actually the alligator capital of the U.S. for a little while. We had a lot of alligator farms here, making boots and purses and all that. And what they used to do to entertain the tourists was they would kidnap African-American kids and have them run around and be chased by alligators.
Oh.
You're kidding me.
No, and we thought this was the most horrifying thing, and we're like, oh my God. And then sure enough, we found in the St. Petersburg History Museum archives, which was invaluable to us while we were researching this, Marta Jones, the archivist there, we love you. But they found a fan from one of these farms that was like promoting the farm, and it has a little African-American kid, almost like the Coppertone ad, being chased by an alligator.
You're
on
kidding.
it. And that was their ad to get people to come see it.
Sick.
Terrible.
That's pretty gruesome. That's pretty gruesome, man.
Oh my gosh. And that's, like I said, we didn't even know if we could put that in the book. And it's one of those, and I'm still spooked to walk down Roser Park because the stories about, it's actually, now it's converted to Minnie Lightning, the voodoo queen of St. Pete, and she sends her little alligator people to come get you. And it's one of those, they're actually trying to make a movie out of it. The Vitali brothers here in St. Petersburg, they're famous mural people. They're actually trying to fund a movie. So if you look up Mini Lights, the movie, you can see a trailer they did, and it's pretty spooky.
Wow, that sounds like it. Thanks.
Boy,
Crazy stuff.
Sinister stuff down there. I never imagined. Let me ask you this: Has anybody seen the ghost of Ernest Hemingway down there in Key West, or has he ever?
That's that's one of the big stories. Jack Kerouac here in St. Pete, his ghost is seen. That was part of the reason we didn't actually do those in the book much, was because those were the ones that were in all the other ghost stories. Yeah, all the other ghost books. Ghosts of St. Pete, Ghosts of Key West. Oh, Babe Ruth haunts the Hotel of the Vinoy, and all this. And so we tried to get the stuff that not everybody knew.
Well, sure.
But Key West Hemingway House is pretty notorious for him being there.
Well, they escaped all that damage from that Harvey, didn't they? As I understand it. I mean, all the cats were okay.
A lot of the places didn't, but we're still, they're still assessing down there. But Robert the Doll seems okay. Ernest Hemingway seems okay. The Artist House apparently survived pretty well. So, we haven't made a trip back down yet ourselves. We're kind of waiting for it to get back to normal, but that's one of our next destinations for a future book. Yeah, as we do a follow-up book.
Well, I was in Vegas that week, and I was I'm just an animal lover. I want to make sure the cats were all right, but Fox News definitely said the cats were okay, so I'm happy to hear that. But evidently, that house has missed a lot of hurricane damage. It's escaped. Quite a few near misses.
There's legends all over the state on how each city protects itself from these storms, and it's kind of crazy. And some of them, some places have never had a direct hit, and you got to wonder.
Yeah, that was really wild, because everybody was kind of like shocked, because they were sure that Key West was just going to get slaughtered, but it did manage to make it.
My favorite thing about the Conch Republic, that's what they call the Key West there, because they seceded from the Union one day.
Oh yeah.
And then declared war on the United States, and then immediately surrendered and demanded $10 billion in foreign aid.
Yeah, I remember
foreign aid.
Well, don't they still sell like citizenship papers or something?
For the Conch Republic. Yeah. That's how kooky that town is. You gotta love it.
Oh my goodness, that is wild.
There's a bunch of eccentrics, it really is, but I don't know, Heidi.
Pretty much all of Florida if you go to the right places.
I guess so. Well, now Jacksonville seemed kind of stayed, though, because it was such a Navy town and all that. It was kind of conservative old place, but
well, that's they had a sea monster and they've got UFO sightings.
Well,
so yeah.
Well, yeah. Now there are lots of UFO sightings. I know there are. As I understand it, now this is, just from dim memory, but didn't Columbus see all kinds of UFO issues when he came over here originally?
He didn't himself, but some of his boats mentioned it. That they saw, stuff flying around, and then they also saw stuff glowing under the water. And we've still got USO reports to this day. I mean, some of the fishermen we talked to up in the up near Gulf Breeze, where the famous UFO flap was back in the 80s. That's Eglin Air Force Base and Pensacola Naval Base. So if there's anything going on up there that might be terrestrial in origin, super secret, I wouldn't be surprised if that's up there. But we had one captain, man, talking to him, it was Eerie, speaking of Eerie, Florida. But he was like his finder, his depth finder, he was in 400 feet depth. And suddenly his depth finder alarm goes off because he's at 12 feet depth. And he freaks out and he rushes out to the deck, and this giant black shape with glowing lights on the corners, comes up from under the water without making a sound, and then hovers above him, giant black triangle, classic, with the few little lights, doesn't make a sound, and hovers there for a little bit, and then takes off at super speed. And the man, talking to him, you could tell this is not something he's making up. This is something he experienced. And he's like, yeah, of course I took pictures. And so we look at his
Mark,
phone, and it's like,
I don't mean to interrupt, Mark, but we're coming right to the end. I urge everybody to go to EerieFlorida.com and
right.
book, because you'd be making a big mistake if you didn't. But we've got to cut out, guys. It's been a great show.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Mark.
thank you guys so much.
Alrighty.
Thank you. We'll send you a link too. Don't worry about it.